Hi, everybody. I'm so glad you're here to join us. As those of you who are members of Plato know, I'm Barbara Klein, the president of the Plato Society. And if you don't know about the Plato Society any more than our colloquia, please look us up online and please visit our study groups. I think you'll love us and we'd love to have you visit. I'm so excited about today's topic. It is important. Couldn't be more timely. And we have a wonderful speaker. And to introduce her is Lise Matthews, the co-chair of the colloquia.
Hello, everyone. I want to introduce to you Dr. Justine Rosenthal. She is an expert in international affairs and terrorism. She formerly served as the head of Newsweek magazine's global operations and as editor-in-chief of the influential journal, The National Interest. Additionally, she has been a scholar at RAND, at Brookings, and at the Council on Foreign Relations, and was a special assistant to former Treasury Secretary Robert E. Rubin. She's taught courses around the world on international relations theory and post-Cold War security issues, most recently at USC. Her work has appeared in numerous publications from Foreign Affairs to the Los Angeles Times. Please welcome Dr. Justine Rosenthal.
Thank you, Lise, for that lovely introduction. I wanted to first just start by saying thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to have the opportunity of speaking to the Plato Society. And indeed, this is a sort of timely topic because I'm sure many of you have been watching and reading all the coverage of the rising tensions and fear of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. In fact, I think it was about a month ago when we were all chatting about exactly where this talk was going to go. Russia was just starting to amass troops on the Ukraine border. And it was such a moving target. No one knew whether we would be at war or the entire conflict would have dissipated by the time I was going to be speaking. And as of right now, we're sort of still in that same place, though we know that tensions are continuing to increase. But what I said then, and I say to all of you now, is that this current standoff is emblematic, no matter how it goes, of a fundamentally changing global order. A global order that I think will continue to be far less stable and more conflict prone in the years to come. Now, since it's impossible to try to touch on every major power in the world, here I'm going to start by addressing briefly how the global dynamics have shifted since the end of the Cold War, then go on to concentrate on the nation states that could present themselves as what we call regional hegemons. That is, states that could control and influence the US's main regions of concern. And that's Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. We're going to look first at China, then move on to Iran, and finally Russia, and then the current state of affairs. So to set the stage, I want to turn the clock back a little bit for just a second and look at where we were at the end of World War II and what became known as the Cold War, when the US and the Soviet Union entered a decades-long standoff. So at the time, it was very surprising that the Cold War ended up bringing in what was coined by many as sort of an era of long peace. Blood was certainly shed in lots of proxy wars, particularly in Afghanistan, but the Soviet Union and the United States never entered into direct conflict with one another. So though initially very treacherous and tenuous, the great powers of the world were militarily, and one could argue, sort of emotionally exhausted post-World War II, and then we managed to kind of glide into this era of relative peace. Moreover, nuclear weapons, which were first thought to be offensive weapons that would lead to war, ended up turning out not to be so. They ended up being much more defensive in nature because of that state that we all know was created that we called MAD, mutually assured destruction. And that was mutually assured destruction between the Soviet Union and the United States. wherein each country would be absolutely decimated if the other country attacked. But they each would have enough time to launch an equally destructive counterattack onto the other. In essence, this is what turned offensive weapons into defensive ones, right? Nobody wants to see this. So this stalemate of sorts between the two great superpowers lasted for an entire era. I bring this up now because you're going to see we're seeing some shifting dynamics with China. So after a period of bipolar stability, as in the US as one pole and the Soviet Union as the other, we then moved into a relatively unprecedented, certainly in modern times, unipolar world, where the United States was the sole great power left standing after the tearing down of the Iron Curtain, the pulling back of the Iron Curtain. The United States and its Western allies used this opportunity to expand NATO. And the repercussions of that is what we are seeing today. But even with our rather aggressive post-Cold War posture, the United States went unrivaled. China and Russia were not yet in a place to balance against us. Now, the global order is fundamentally changing because we are entering a state that is likely to be much more multipolar in nature. Back to those old, scary kind of World War I, World War II times, where there will be several nation states again vying for power, influence, and resources. Let me say that as dire as I may be sounding, the United States need only control the Western Hemisphere for us to have security. In some measure, because we have a fundamental protection of two enormous moats, right? The Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And our two neighboring contiguous countries, Mexico and Canada, are de facto part of our natural sphere of influence and pose no national security threat. So we are in an unprecedentedly secure position. And that's just the luck of geography. But other countries are now rising and therefore potentially destabilizing this global order. This is primarily, quite obviously, China, who has the potential to become a peer competitor, an equal, if you will, in the great power game. But we also have a clearly resurgent Russia and an assertive Iran. So let me take on the issue of China first. The country's rise was, as I sort of said earlier, largely inevitable. Its large physical landmass, large population, and expanding military, in which they put a lot of resources, and an aggressive resource-seeking foreign policy have laid the groundwork for a significant great power. And the US will and should look at China's posture with concern. There is first their ever-expanding presence in the South China Seas, which will likely mean that many Asian nation states will fall into and under China's sphere of influence, just as Western powers do unto the United States. And China is trying to shore up its global influence in other ways, particularly through a program called the Belt and Road Initiative, commonly referred to, and we love acronyms, as the BRI, or the New Silk Road. It was announced already back in 2003 by China's president, Xi Jinping, during trips to Kazakhstan and Indonesia. Xi's goals for this are to create a vast network of railways, energy pipelines, and other major infrastructure up through the former Soviet republics, all the way into Europe, and back down through Pakistan and India, and into the rest of Southeast Asia. This is all with the goal of expanding China's reach and countering US power and influence. And at the same time, China is also attempting through this initiative a maritime Silk Road, which includes investing in ports all along the Indian Ocean, stretching all the way to Africa, and shoring up China's access to Middle East energy supplies. To show you some level of success that they've had, more than 60 countries, which is basically over 2/3 of the world's nation states, have signed on to some form of Chinese projects. And China has already spent about $200 billion on these projects around the globe. You know, there's always a good side and a bad side, and this has been true for China with the BRI initiative. Not all of it has been good news. When many of these countries sign on to these projects with China, they do so with loans from China. And these are loans they often can't pay back. And a lot of the equipment can't be monitored or maintained without Chinese parts and labor. So China is already seeing a lot of pushback on this. There have been protests in Malaysia and Kazakhstan. There is concern that Kenya won't be able to pay its loan for a high-speed railroad. And Sri Lanka was unable to pay back its loan on a port. So the port is now on lease to China for 99 years, providing Beijing, not coincidentally, with a strategic foothold in the Indian Ocean. So far, the US has been slow to counter this and really hasn't done much, but for the fact that finally, President Joe Biden announced a Build Back Better World initiative last year at the G7 summit. But this is basically 7 years after China started funding their own program. On the missile front, China has also begun to work on a hypersonic missile capability, which could be used as a first strike nuclear capability against the United States. And these weapons would likely thwart our missile defense systems because, unlike the ballistic missiles of the Cold War, which we all still have, hypersonic nuclear glide missiles can be maneuvered. And that's how they evade our weapons system. Now, America is working on a similar technology. We're further behind. And this puts us back in a world where China could possibly launch a surprise attack, and therefore mutually assured destruction would not necessarily exist. So the US has a two-pronged approach. One is to continue to adapt our own missile defense systems, and also to try to keep on pace with China in regards to hypersonic missiles, potentially and hopefully recreating a stalemate of sorts. Now, the much bigger question is how sustainable China's rise really is, because some of its very strengths may turn into fundamental weaknesses. Namely, the extremely large and aging population is going to take a toll on the state financially. And the shrinking younger generation, which was born out of the one-child policy, will take a toll on the state as well in terms of sheer manpower. In the United States, immigration allows us to maintain a population even with declining birth rates at home. China's current policies do not afford them that same luxury. And all of this, combined with enormous wealth disparity, may well lead to internal instability within China. China is no longer in the heady days of seeing 7 to 8% GDP growth year per year. In fact, by 2050, China is still unlikely to reach even half of America's GDP per capita. China, Xi Jinping, are well aware of this fact. A grumbling middle class and increasingly angry rural workers means the Chinese state needs to address, as President Xi himself put it, the principal contradiction between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. I can tell you from having lived there myself, you could see all this percolating even a decade or more ago. For now, the US is a global superpower with China close on its heels, nipping there. But there's more to the global great power game than just the two of us. And that's why I want to move on to two regional superpowers that I see as having the greatest possibly destabilizing impact over the next decade. And I think they're going to have an impact on international relations over the next decade, period, for better or worse. And let me take us on a turn first to Iran. So as I'm sure most of you already know, Iran's long-term goal is to create a Shia crescent spreading throughout the Middle East, from Tehran through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea itself, thereby dominating the region. And I think there is little doubt that of all the nation states there, Iran is the most likely contender to take its place as a regional hegemon, to really control that area. They're up against Saudi Arabia a bit, but I don't think Saudi Arabia is going to rise to the same level of influence as Iran. Now, currently, Iran, of course, is suffering under the weight of massive Western sanctions, but it continues to maintain and spread its influence regardless. The US invasion of Iraq and the subsequent chaos there created the perfect space for Iran to insert itself into Iraqi politics. In fact, I would argue the true winner of the US-led war in Iraq was really Iran. And in many ways, Iraq now functions as a proxy state, much as does Lebanon. And with Russia and Iran's alliance in Syria to prop up Assad's regime, Iran now has solidified its influence there, and perhaps even more importantly, strengthened their alliance with Russia. This is a perfect example of this realignment of the global order. There were recent joint naval exercises, mainly for show, between China, Russia, and Iran. Now, even though this would flow perfectly into moving our discussion into Russia, I do realize I cannot leave the topic of Iran without addressing their nuclear weapons program. So though it hasn't hit the headlines quite as much, the US and Iran are close to forging a new non-proliferation deal to replace the deal made under the Obama administration and scuttled by Trump. A new deal would obviously provide much needed sanctions relief for the Iranian regime, and a mechanism by which to slow down Iran's uranium enrichment program, which skyrocketed during the Trump administration, where we had it down around 4% based on our previous agreement. There was some cheating going on, no doubt, but they were enriching uranium up to 20% by the end of Trump's time in office. And by April of last year, they were even enriching small amounts of uranium at 60% levels. And the higher the enrichment level, the closer you are to a nuclear weapon. So a truly worst case scenario is not just a nuclear armed Iran, but the consequences of that would be nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East. That's to say, it's hard to imagine a world in which Iran has nuclear weapons and Saudi Arabia and Egypt do not quickly follow suit. And the most dangerous time during nuclear proliferation is when those capabilities are being built, because it leaves a window of opportunity, again, for a first strike by a nuclear armed nation against another before they have that same capability and can retaliate. Turning next to our other global rising power, and sometime ally of both Iran and China, we come to Russia. So it's a nation state putting itself firmly back in the great power game. It's right in that global firmament now. And it's asserting itself with gusto. And here I think it's vital that we try to understand what Putin views as Russia. Because for him, Russia is a much broader motherland than the current borders that exist within the Russian state, as it was defined in some ways by the West after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's hard to underestimate, at least for me, I think, just how much Russia ended up reeling in the wake of the Soviet Union's dismantlement. America might have been promising a new shining vision of liberal democracy in the face of a truly unsustainable and failing communist system. But our promises never materialized. We didn't deliver. And what came instead was decades of economic instability, a sense of betrayal by the Russian people, and eventually the resurgence of nationalism, which I think we are also seeing as an aside across the globe. And many would argue as sort of the natural counterweight to globalization. So I think we shouldn't be surprised by the current state of affairs, as unfortunate as they are. Russia has long made clear that NATO expansion and the inclusion of Georgia and Ukraine in particular in that expansion was unacceptable, a true red line. and an existential threat as far as Russia's national security was concerned. So NATO's stated plan would, in essence, leave no buffer between Russia and Western powers. And that's really the rub, I think, for Putin, as it would be for many leaders. And then add on top of that, that there are portions of the populations in both of these states, that being Ukraine and Georgia, that actually still do see themselves as Russian. Many of you will remember back in 2008, with rising tensions between Russia and Georgia, and coming on the heels of the election of a pro-Western president, Saakashvili, in Georgia, war eventually broke out in two semi-autonomous regions in Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that Putin believed to be a part of Russian domination and dominion. The two regions, armed and backed by Russia, are now de facto under Russian control. Those two regions made up, or they make up, about 20% of Georgia's overall population. So we saw exactly the same thing happen with Crimea in 2014, after the pro-Russian president of the Ukraine was overthrown and a more Western-leading president came into power. Crimea had been a part of Ukraine since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Putin believed it also to be a part of Russia. And once Ukraine moved in this more pro-Western direction, Russia invaded and annexed the region, just as it had done to the two in Georgia. So the pattern of behaviors is relatively obvious. And each time Russia claimed there was military provocation by the other state, and then uses this as the justification for their own invasion. So I think right now, though the broader question of NATO expansion remains key to Moscow, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the Q&A, in the short term, we are also talking about the fate of a separatist region in eastern Ukraine. So I think Putin's got his eye on another spot that borders Russia. It's called Donbass. Russia has, in essence, they're gone down a similar path as it did in South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Crimea, right? Without a full throttled invasion. These territories are also becoming de facto a part of Russia. And a few years ago, I'll give a little personal anecdote. I did a documentary about Putin's biker gang, the Night Wolves, and their philosophy largely mirrors that of Putin. Putin even gives this biker group money, in one case, about $1 million, to help them put on these shows with fireworks and motorcycle stuntmen. They're sort of extravaganzas that celebrate Russian pride. And this biker gang is not only in Russia proper, but also in Chechnya and these two eastern regions of Ukraine. So when we had to go send our crew in there, we had to fly first into Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, because like in all these other regions, coming in through Russia is considered illegal because of Western sanctions and the Western view of who controls these territories. And the Night Wolves themselves are even on the US sanctions list. And the crew that we sent, none of them could be US citizens. And we sent them through a sort of no man's land that isn't really ruled by either side, on the border of sort of Western Ukraine and into this war-torn eastern region. But what you see there when you do get into Donbass, and what you hear from many of the Night Wolves and what we heard from many of the people there, also many of whom who fought for Russia against Ukraine, is that they believe themselves to be a part of a Russian motherland, that they are Russian. Now, obviously, a full-blown invasion of Ukraine is another matter entirely. And we're going to see what happens, you know? But I do think we will see Putin successfully cleave off these border regions, and the de facto control of any number of the bits he's already cleaved off will become de jure control. And that may be part of what the West will have to accept if there is a bargain for peace. So here, I think hindsight, of course, is 2020. NATO expansion post-Cold War was inevitably going to be a point of contention and possible conflict the moment Russia got its act back together. And what is happening now, I think in the Ukrainian situation and in all of the diplomacy we're seeing, is a sort of microcosm of what's to come. You already see the tensions and posturing for power amongst nation states within the EU. Once again, France and Germany each want to assert their dominance. Macron visiting Putin to try his hand at being the diplomatic face of Europe, while Germany's heavy reliance on energy from Russia makes their national interests different from those of other EU member states. We've also seen a continuing special relationship between Britain and the US that's only been amplified with Brexit. And now add Australia to that list. A truly special relationship is occurring there amid the fracturing of relations with France, when America gave Australia submarine technology that bettered the original deal Australia had cut with France a few years earlier. And as I'm sure you all saw, the French were furious. And as America continues its long promised, never quite delivered pivot towards Asia, the group known as the Quad, that's the US, Australia, India, and Japan, is becoming more formalized as all four countries worry about China's increasingly assertive behavior. This Quad held their first joint naval exercises together in over a decade in November of 2020. And President Biden convened a virtual meeting of the country's leaders in March of this year, March of 2021, pardon me. And this is one of America's best ways of projecting power into the Indo-Pacific region. I think it's no surprise China's President Xi's first face-to-face meeting with another world leader since COVID began, so in the last 2 years, was with Vladimir Putin at the start of the Winter Olympics. But they may not be natural allies, and we don't know how long this will last. But for now, certainly, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Xi will be keeping a close eye on how Putin fares in Ukraine, because he may well see America's positioning in that conflict as a harbinger for a standoff with the US over Taiwan. And with all of that pleasant news, I will hand it over for questions.
Okay, questions. I have a whole stack of questions.
Oh dear.
So I'm going to try and group some of them. You've talked about China's weakness. What about the US weakness, the $30 trillion national debt, the issues we have with education, homelessness, healthcare, racism, etc.? Can the US still be considered a world hegemon and compete with other rising powers?
You know, Lisa, I think obviously we have some very deep problems at home. Hopefully all of which will be, addressed. I don't hold out massive hope, but I would still argue that America's innate power, it far exceeds, at least for the moment, some of these other states that we're talking about, who, as bad as things may be here, things are far worse over there.
Okay, another question. Okay, do you really believe?
Oh dear.
Oh, do you
really believe what you just said?
Do you believe that Putin really believes that NATO, a NATO-backed Georgia or a NATO-backed Ukraine would attack Russia? When has NATO attacked any state? Let's forget about Bush II's attack on Iraq. But when has NATO done any offensive? Has NATO always been a defensive group? And is Putin basically BSing?
Look, I think there's some posturing and yes, BSing, because that's how you get what you want in the international political game. I mean, do we really think he wants to invade Ukraine and try to occupy it and take it back? I mean, I think there are, as I said, bits of it that he does want. And states do not like other enemy states to be right up against them. No, I don't think he thinks that NATO is really going to invade, but you never know what's going to happen. I mean, the Soviet Union at its inception certainly didn't think it was going to collapse and see the dissolution of an entire conceptual idea fall apart, and the West basically nursed them back to poor health. So that is part of it. I also do think that there's the reality about nuclear weapons that is important to Russia. And it's not just Putin. He happens to be a great statistician, but almost all, I think any leader of a country there would probably feel this way. He wants back into the intermediate nuclear weapons agreement with the United States, right? Because we all agreed to keep them far enough away that we wouldn't have first strike capabilities against each other. And he doesn't want particularly to see, well, I don't know, particularly does not want weapons like that in Poland. And let's not go to say Georgia and Ukraine, which if they were under
Romania, I mean,
or Romania, correct,
already in Romania,
right? Which is and this was an agreement that was torn up under the Trump administration, and I think this is another possible bargaining chip, and part of what Putin is probably after with what's going on in Ukraine right now.
Okay, we're going to switch to Iran.
Okay.
Do you think we will get some sort of agreement? And then do you think the US Senate would ever ratify it?
I do think we're going to get an agreement. I think it behooves everyone to do so. Hopefully we'll get a slightly better agreement. I don't know the details yet of where we will get to, but we know things were worse when we didn't have this pact. So I don't like getting caught up on the fact that Iran always cheats, and even when it lets the weapons inspectors in, it's doing something else on the side. The fact is their nuclear program skyrocketed, forgive the sort of pun, over the last 4 years. So, and then will the Senate ratify? How quickly can we get this done? I think that's why the pressure is on. I don't want to say don't quote me, because you can quote me and just tell me I was wrong, but I think with this current Senate, yes, we would get something through.
Okay, I'm going to go back to, because I have several questions having to do with what is all of this that's going on in Ukraine. On one side, is it a diversion for Putin's concerns about his own public distaste, his public's distaste for his corruption? Or is this feint on his part a test of NATO's will? And then on the other side, from the US, how much of our posturing might be a revisiting of the military industrial complex wanting someplace to stick their finger now that they're not in Afghanistan?
All right.
Is that too many questions?
No. I think I got them. Look, I think there's always the natural kind of tit for tat that happens when you make an enemy out of someone else. This is the question of whether this is a diversion from his corruption. I don't think he really needs to divert the country from his corruption, but I think he gets lots of bonus. You always get an uptick, right? Your war uptick. Mm-hmm. So he's not going to mind that part. But I do think it's a test of the US resolve. I do think it's a test of NATO resolve. This is why, again, I think that Putin's sense of NATO knocking on his doorstep is something he doesn't like and wants to make sure doesn't happen. Again, I think that this is not only a test of our resolve, but a test potentially of our weakness, which is why I don't think we should have done NATO expansion, as you can hear. But I don't think we should necessarily look like, present ourselves as pussycats. So the best, and I think the most likely possible diplomatic outcome, again, is for us to sort of cede this territory off to the side, let the Ukrainians do so, and also for the Ukrainians to basically say, we don't want NATO anytime soon, mm-hmm. Which unfortunately I don't think is quite happening yet, but maybe they can be brought there. There's been lots of talk about it becoming more like a Finland. I don't think that's really the answer. I think it's for them to take themselves out of that equation. They're still moving towards the West regardless. And I think that gets it. Then there's this question of how much is US posturing? I don't think that we should fight this war with our actual soldiers. And I don't think that that's the plan should the unfortunate events of a hot conflict play out. I think we will help arm the Ukrainians, we will help arm an insurgency, but we're not going to fight this one. And I think that probably, besides just throwing up our hands, that was our best option.
That speaks somewhat and almost answers this question, which is the US defended the Afghans from the Taliban for years, failed. Is it smart for the US to defend the pro-Western Ukrainians from pro-Russian Ukrainians? So have you answered that question already?
I mean, again, there may be a very slow seep to what's going on here, in that Putin's pulling off of all these little bits of region in Georgia and Ukraine that are next to his border. That may continue, I think. I don't know if, I think I've covered all of this, but maybe there's a bit I'm missing.
No, I think I'm just being a good moderator.
No, and I know, and I might have lost my train of thought for a second, so.
Why don't we switch it for a moment? Hold on. 1 second. You've talked about NATO versus Russia. Do you think Putin's concern is primarily with NATO, or do you think his concern is mostly with keeping the EU, in essence, a customer of his?
Yeah. You know, I know that there's actually been debate in my house about how much of this is about NATO expansion and how much of this is about EU expansionism, which is sort of to the side of what's being postulated here, which is the kind of clientelism. But wanting to keep Europe as a client, this would seem counterintuitive to that for me, right? Because really, if you're a European nation right now, you're going, I've really got to figure out what I'm going to do about my energy problem, because I don't want to have to be reliant on Russia for that. I mean, the Germans are feeling the full force of that. What one of the goals may be is to see some of the fracturing of NATO and the EU that we are seeing here, which is, you know, as great as these institutions are on paper and are often in times of peace, I think we still see nation states' individual interests dominate everything. And that is why, particularly in a situation like this, you are seeing, you know, a tussle between countries that have really been, you know, getting along like good friends when there hasn't been war and energy and resources at stake. And their collective bargaining power within that structure is not working in the Russian one. And that, I think, is to the advantage of Putin.
Since you've started to talk about individual nation states, give us some of your thoughts about the rise of authoritarian regimes in formerly democratic countries. What do you think is underlying this rise of the extreme right-wing groups in many countries? Look at the truckers.
Yeah, this is, I alluded to it earlier, it's a fascinating and unfortunate phenomenon. I think that this is in part from birthed as a counterweight to mercantilism, to this massive kind of global economy, the sense that, you know, business uber alles, that has disenfranchised enormous portions of populations, that we are seeing huge economic disparities everywhere. Right? I could say that about almost every single nation state that we're going to talk about, or that I've touched upon here. And that sort of the counterweight to extreme globalism and a truly sort of global economy in which individuals feel no purchase is an extreme nationalism, and that nationalism, I don't want to do a Trump bashing, but it's this Trumpian phenomenon, right? Someone who just says, all right, forget it. I care about what happens here. I care about all of you sort of regular people. And I think we're seeing that populating all over the globe. I mean, if you can see it here, you can see it anywhere.
Okay, two questions getting back to the Ukraine issue. One is a slightly more technical one. The US has provided Ukraine with anti-tank Javelin missiles,
Yeah.
but no air defense systems. Why no air defense systems? Any idea?
I'm going to do the don't talk to what you don't know. I don't have the full details of that, so
I'll take that.
I'm going to take that pass on that one.
Okay, and what do you think is the likelihood that what the US is really trying to do is to stall Nord Stream 2? That's the gas pipeline.
Yeah, no,
Are we?
I don't. I mean, I'm deeply enjoying these questions about sort of, are we trying to stall Nord Stream 2? I mean, that's going to be Germany's problem.
That's exactly
right. Not ours. It's the same as. Do I think that all this conflict is being ramped up by the military-industrial complex? Going back to an earlier thing, you can all hear that a lot of me is relatively cynical, but I don't always go that cynical. So I don't think this is manufactured tension. I think it is very real. I will admit I'm surprised by how much it has ramped up.
Mm-hmm.
And that when many people within the policy world and the wonk world and the blob and the non-blob all sort of see the same way out of this, why we're not getting more headway there. Because I don't think I'm being revelatory in saying there's a couple of regions that are really already part of Russia, that are going to stay a part of Russia, that we can have the Ukrainians speak for themselves in a way that would de-escalate tensions, and that we don't really need, Macron, et cetera, each running over to Putin to beg for his audience.
So how do you evaluate Biden's response to Putin? Do you have an opinion?
I do. Look, I think, as I said, I don't think he's done it. Given the hand he's been dealt, I think that this is a reasonable response. I mean, what I would like to see in terms of policy is for us to be meddling less in other people's business, to be letting these regions, to only intervene when absolutely necessary. This sort of philosophy of offshore balancing. This is not to be isolationist. Not to say we curl up, in a ball and go back home. Say, Europe, Russia. This is a Eurasian Europe Russia problem. You guys sort it out. We will come in if really nothing else. If nothing else is going to work. Again, like we did many, many times. And as I said, I think that this is probably the most measured response that Biden could have. We're not, to all of a sudden say we weren't going to do anything to help Ukraine would have been bad signaling. And there's some debate about how much signaling matters, but I think it does. And I think it matters here, as I said, particularly because of Taiwan. And we're going to have to decide, I think, at some point how we're going to really handle that policy. So this is, again, not troops on the ground in Ukraine fighting Russian troops, which I think would be a disaster, but rather at least arming the Ukrainians as best we can to fight what would be a prolonged insurgency against something I don't necessarily think is going to happen.
Okay, I have one more question on Ukraine, and then I'm going to switch to another of your specialties, which is terrorism. But I do want to ask this question. The Donbass has always self-identified as Russian, from what we understand, and was the industrial heartland of Ukraine, producing equipment for integrated industrial Russian factories, for example, engines for their MIL helicopters. I may be saying that wrong. Do you believe that Russia will be satisfied with no Russian pushback on annexation of just the Donbass and withdraw beyond that? Or do they want all of Ukraine?
I think we're seeing the slow trickle. I think they might be satisfied for now. That's why I think that's the place of possible compromise. And I think we will see this again. Right? I mean, And I don't think that they necessarily have the ambitions of taking back all of Ukraine. I don't think that's where we are, but I think slowly hewing back bits along their border, again, where it seems obvious to the Russians that this is, again, it's part of this motherland, as opposed to the borders that were sort of forced upon them with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So no, I don't think it's the end, but I think it could be a stopgap.
Okay, so back to your other specialty, which is terrorism.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about that much.
No, we didn't. But are you okay if I throw
Absolutely.
it? Okay, so give us a few minutes on your knowledge about terrorism, both international and domestic, and the role that it plays. You think it might play in this changing new world order?
Okay, let me start with domestic. Okay, because I don't think that the terrorism problem is going away anytime soon. But let me also say that, you know, as awful as terrorist attacks are, we clearly had an extremely overblown reaction, right? Which led us down a path of 20 years of absolutely unnecessary war.
Mm-hmm.
I would have certainly a retaliatory attack on the Taliban, I think, was a reasonable response to them being, you know, the safe haven that they were to Al Qaeda. But this has spurred, you know, the birth of thousands more, millions more jihadis. I said I was going to start at home, so let me just put that out there and say the domestic problem is not going to go away because we have this sort of rising, very unhappy, extreme right wing here in this country. And I guess it depends what you want to consider, you know, terrorism. How do we look at the January 6th? How do we look at those people who participated? What other things are they capable of doing? I also think, you know, you have the incel movement, all of these unhappy, disenfranchised, unmarried men. You know, we all know that. I mean, I don't want to get into it, and I'm not sure what the right words are going to be, but who can become lone shooters. And we have obviously a massive gun policy problem here that you're not going to see anywhere else. And then I also want to say there is a sort of a left-wing anarchist movement that is bubbling up on the other side of this, often populated, sadly, by veterans of these wars on terror who come home and have a very difficult time integrating back into society after giving years of service. And so that has been another one of the sort of prices that has been paid for 20 years of war. Moving beyond our borders, I mean, now the Taliban are back in control of Afghanistan, not great control, right? They have control of it, but they have absolutely no way to manage it. So that's going to be a failed state, already basically run by Pakistan anyway. They just, you know, had to sit by and wait for us to finally leave. I don't think that they're going to be home to an Al Qaeda, but that doesn't really matter anymore, right? Because there are so many groups that have come off of this, and ISIS is a much more extreme version of this kind of jihadi philosophy than Al Qaeda ever was. That being said, so I think we're going to see it continuing in Syria and continuing throughout the Middle East, and maybe it will again come back here. But I think that it is, in the long term, less of a problem than our major rivals. And I think that that is where we took our eye off the ball, right? It's letting, you know, a bee sting affect you more than a concussion. And I think that we also have to keep in mind when we decide how we're going to react to terrorism. You know, we can thwart, the intelligence community can thwart 1,000. You know, it's like a batting average. 1,000 of these attacks, one can still get through. We have to, it would be great if the country could build a resilience to outside terrorist attacks so that we don't overreact. You know, the way that the British had to do when there were a lot, attacks when the troubles in Ireland, and as many other countries, and as Israel has had to do. Again, one wishes it not to be so, but I think that may be our reality going forward.
I have a question going back to Putin and Ukraine. Did the poor US coordination in leaving Afghanistan have anything to do with Putin's aggressive military buildup along the Ukrainian border? Do you think the fact that we kind of flubbed one thing, he's looking at us and going, now's the time?
Well, let me say, I think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was an absolute disaster. I mean, that is a given. That was not a good look. I think we should have left. I think we should have left a long time ago. I think we are absolutely terrible nation builders and should just get out of that business, shut the doors. But I don't think the two are attached. You may think it's a nice time to do it. It also doesn't seem like Biden has that much power, strength at home and support at home. There's also the weather. When the ground there thaws, those Russian tanks can't move. So I think it's a series of things. Also, Putin thought he was going to have another 4 glorious years of pro-Putin foreign policy in America. And so it was a matter of also testing our resolve.
Our brief discussion on terrorism has spawned a question.
Okay.
Is terrorism an area where we could have potential cooperation among the US, China, and Russia? Since three.
We all hate terrorism.
Okay.
So I think yes, we each face the slightly different terrorism problems. So I'm not sure exactly where we're going to see a ton of coordination there, especially because we have been accusing China of repressing its Uyghur population. This goes back into the sense of how does China deal with the Muslim world, and the tensions there. I mean, as I said in my talk, I see a lot of room, unfortunately, for Russia-China cooperation. I think that when it comes to terrorism, the West seems to stand a bit more together. And again, 9/11 was so unprecedented. I don't think anyone's going to really cooperate too much with us anymore on anything. And, that would have to do with that, except a lot of intelligence cooperation. I don't think that's out of the question, but I think, again, it's much more likely among the Western powers, unfortunately.
I have a new interesting question that's just popped up. Do you think Putin is just waiting for the Olympics to end so that he doesn't offend Xi?
Well, I haven't thought about it like that. As I said, I think he's waiting out NATO and seeing what we're going to do and seeing what US resolve is. I'm sure he also doesn't want to really ruin Xi's Olympic Games, though they're not going all that well. I mean, the Olympics has now, become so politicized and such a disaster. But as I said, Putin grabbed the opportunity to go, visit with Xi at the outset of the Olympics to sort of say, like, we're going to be on side here. When the West puts all these sanctions on Russia and we're in need of other kinds of resources, you'll do what you did for us before, right? And Xi's going to say, yes, absolutely, and we're going to make sure you have other sources of your own oil, and we're going to price gouge you for it too, because we know how much you need us. So for now, for China, this is a win-win.
Okay, I'm going to go back to, I'm scrolling because I don't take all questions in order for those that post them, in case you don't know.
Well, it's wonderful having this lively discussion. I wish I could see everybody.
Looking at this possibly from Russia's point of view, JFK, was he right to enforce the Monroe Doctrine over the Cuban crisis? Should we have any empathy for Russia with their concern about our missiles in Romania at the moment and soon to be in Poland?
Well, right, this is absolutely to the point. we like to do what's good for the goose is not good for the gander. I don't know. Empathy, I don't know how much empathy exists in sort of the brutal world of great power politics, but yeah, do I get it? Yes. As I said, I think that Russia genuinely does not like seeing NATO encroaching on what it considers to be at least a buffer zone for them. And no, does not want to have missiles that can reach their territory before there's ever a chance for them to have to strike back. And in truth, it's also not great for us because, right, we don't want a nuclear conflict. We want nuclear de-escalation. And we are setting ourselves up for exactly the opposite of that.
So to sort of wrap up,
Okay.
I think we're at the end of our hour. What would you say as a final wrap up? Do you have anything that we should be looking at that maybe the rest of us have not paid attention to?
I mean, I think that a lot from the questions here, one of the main focuses is really on just seeing the world through others' eyes in order to better inform our policies. And this question of how much America wants to be the world's policeman, how much we want to intervene, how much we feel that is our moral obligation, how much we feel that this, spreading liberal democracy, you can hear how I feel about this, spreading liberal democracy throughout the world is actually to our benefit, it seems to often go the other way. And then again, rather than thinking of taking a step back as retreat, thinking of that as strength. And I think that is, and fingers crossed that this does not escalate into full-fledged war.
I'm going to see if any more questions have come up. They have not. So I want to say thank you very much, Dr.
My
Rosenthal.
pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You will come back and speak to us again.
I would very much enjoy that.
And I will now mention that our next colloquium is going to be with Susan D. Anderson. She's the history curator at the California African American Museum. And she is going to talk about California's hidden African American history. She has a book coming out soon, and maybe out already, that is the first ever history of California African Americans and their transforming impact on civic life in the state from the gold rush all the way up through Black Lives Matter. That will be March 24th via Zoom. We're still via Zoom. Thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you next month.